And just first of all, thank you very much. We only have 2 late night shopping nights left before Christmas, and it's very kind of you to give up your one of those 2 nights to come and sit in what must be the most uncomfortable lecture in the world, not just in Edinburgh. I know, because I was a medical student here and I had to sit many long lectures up at the back there on a Monday morning wondering why I was practicing medicine. And anyway, it's probably one of the few places where the audience feels as uncomfortable as the lecturer does. So thank you for giving up your time. Now, I come to the subject of studying the brain as someone who for a long time was mainly interested in stroke, which is a disease of the blood vessels. And as I have become more interested in more wider aspects of brain disease, I have been struck over and over and over again by how much the blood vessels are just sort of ignored in some parts of neuroscience. So I was pleased to have this opportunity to tell you a little bit about why the blood vessels, I think, are important and should be given more attention. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the brain from a rather practical point of view, just to give you a few sort of basic bits of information. Much of the work I do comes from studying people using scanning methods, so I need to tell you a little bit about what the brain looks like on scanning, and then a little bit about some important disorders of the blood vessels, which actually tell us a great deal about dementia and other forms of brain disease, not just stroke. And then a little bit about what goes wrong with the blood vessels, how the blood cells and the blood vessel cells and the brain cells work very closely together in very, very clever ways, which we're really just beginning to understand, and what happens when that starts to go wrong, and what can we do about it. So that's just a little summary. So starting with a few home truths. So as Giles said, the brain is probably one of the most complex, sophisticated objects on the planet. It doesn't weigh very much. It only weighs about 2% of your body weight, not dissimilar to a bag of sugar. And the power usage of your brain, so if you added up all of the reactions and all the energy that's being used in your brain just at rest, it's equivalent to a sort of 20-watt light bulb, which is that. That's actually quite bright. And that's at rest. So when you're doing something, your power usage, your power output goes up. So my brain is probably working somewhat harder than your brains, but you can think of yourselves as a bunch of slightly dimly glowing light bulbs in the audience. That's a kind of slightly a lower quality model. Anyway. And it's very dependent on having a very good energy supply because it can't store any energy. The one downside of the brain is that it hasn't got any space left to store energy. So it has to get a blood supply that allows it to get all of its energy, its sugars and its oxygen. And in order to do that, it needs a very, very efficient blood supply. And it also not only needs to get the blood in, but it needs to be able to get rid of all the waste products, if you can imagine all the waste products that get generated by doing this. And because it all has to pack into a fairly small space, it's actually very, very compact and it's very cleverly put together. And so, for example, in the brain, with all your wiring and everything else that's in there, about 70% of the space is used for moving the information around, and about 20% for the actual processing of that information, and another 10% approximately to keep everything filed properly so that you can remember what you need to remember and plan things and so on. And so it's a highly efficient structure in terms of its space and the energy output that it can cope with for that. Now, if you contrast that with a computer, so you have your laptop or your mobile phone, which is essentially a fancy computer, or any actually of one of the very large computers like Watson, or which competed at Jeopardy some years ago, or the Go computer, which AlphaGo, which Google put together and which competed with humans at chess or at AlphaGo. they have a power usage which is vastly in excess of what the human brain uses. So, for example, in the case of Watson, it's about 80 kilowatts, which is 4,000 times the power output of the human brain. But the thing here is that it's very space inefficient. So it uses only about very small fraction of the space for processing, about 1% of its space in the wires to move the information around, and the rest is just a big empty box full of air. And the biggest challenge is to dissipate all of the heat, the waste that's used, that's generated in doing all of its thinking. And so the clever thing about computing is to try and reduce the space, reduce the heat output, so that it can be compacted into smaller and smaller things. And of course the biggest problem with computers is, unlike the brain, which is very good at mixing water and electricity, your average computer will not last very long if you try and mix water with it. So what's the sort of solution to this? Well, it's this very efficient network of blood vessels. So this illustration here shows you a little tiny microscopic image of some blood vessels in the brain and all the various cells linked to it. And for one of the common expressions is that every nerve in the brain has a vessel. This tiny, tiny mesh of vessels going from the macroscopic brain down to the tiniest blood vessels, so that no nerve cell is very far from a blood vessel, which is supplying this energy and getting rid of the waste products. And the actual surface area over which that takes place inside your head, if you can imagine all those blood vessels spread out into one big common flat surface, that would be equivalent to approximately the surface area of a tennis court. So that surface area is scrunched up inside your brain in the lining of the blood vessels. And then in order to get the energy and oxygen and everything else that's needed, about 1 litre to 1.5 litres of blood go through your brain every minute. And if you think about that, it's actually quite a tricky engineering problem, because it's equivalent to trying to get that much beer that is about 1 litre to 1.5 litres of beer. And I would challenge anybody even to drink that in a minute. Just to get it down your throat in a minute would be really challenging. It's a huge volume, and yet it's got to get through this structure in a very, very efficient way. And all I can say at this point, and I'll come back to this, is that the brain is designed in such a way that it can achieve that, to get the energy in, get the waste products out, and manage all the nerve cells, literally by coping with these large volumes on a minute-to-minute, beat-to-beat basis. So the next thing is, okay, so how do we understand some of this stuff? Well, some of it's come from understanding more about the brain through scanning, through imaging. So I just wanted to show you a little bit about some of what brain scans look like and how we can interpret them. So this is a couple of very typical images. If you went to the doctor and they sent you to the hospital to have a brain scan and you were going for a magnetic resonance scan, this is a couple of very typical, normal appearing slices through the brain. But one of the things is that the brain, as you get older, changes. It obviously grows with you, but it changes throughout life. And as you get older, several things happen. Typically, you lose some of that brain volume, and you also develop abnormalities in the brain, which for many, many years have just been passed off as if they were normal consequences of aging. But the problem is that they can't just be normal consequences of aging, because they actually vary considerably. So this is a 7-year-old. These are 3D printed plastic brains generated from brain scans. This is one of our former research fellows who was 25 at the time. This is somebody in their early 70s, and this is somebody in their early 90s. So you can see how things sort of change, and obviously there's a lot of individual variation anyway, but it's very big. And so as people age, the variation in the rate of brain loss and the rate of development of these abnormalities, these white matter patchy areas, is extremely variable. And we know now that these things actually relate to things like physical frailty to cognitive ability to other factors. Highly variable. So that's telling us something really important that we need to probably pay more attention to. Now, what about some of the important blood vessel diseases? So I'm going to start at one end with a very obvious blood vessel disease. So stroke is a very obvious blood vessel problem. There are two main types of stroke. You get strokes when a blood vessel has become blocked, and you get strokes when a blood vessel bursts. And it is unarguable that this disease is due to a problem in the blood vessels. And the problem with stroke is it's actually quite common. There are 70 million per year worldwide. It's still quite disabling, although it's now one of the most treatable neurological conditions with clot-busting drugs and aspirin for prevention and statins and all sorts of things, and blood pressure control. It's still got quite a devastating effect. It's the second commonest cause of death worldwide because not everybody in every country can access good prevention and good treatment, and it's still the commonest cause of dependency in adults. So it's still a really important condition, and it is unarguably a disease where the blood vessels affect the brain. But that's not the only way that the blood vessels affect the brain. As scanning has become more common, we've become increasingly aware of something which is referred to as silent cerebrovascular disease, silent in inverted commas. And this is now recognized to represent these lesions, these white matter areas, these white splodges, which build up as time goes on. And on average, about 7% of people in their sort of 50s to 60s will have some of these on a scan. Otherwise healthy, normal people just living in the community. But by the time you get into your 70s to 80s, roughly 17 to 20% of people will have these on their brain scan. So to a certain extent, they are an inevitable consequence of aging. But on the other hand, you don't want to have too many of them. Because we know that these are associated with having worsening cognitive ability, worsening physical function, also things like depression, and that they are related to somewhere in the region of about almost half of all dementias. And if you have these on your brain scan, we also know that your future risk of cognitive decline and future risk of stroke is quite increased compared with somebody of the same age and all other things being equal who doesn't have those on their scan. So they are important. Now, stroke's not the only disease due to blood vessel diseases. Actually, there's quite a lot of accumulating evidence to suggest that Alzheimer's disease, other dementias, which we've typically thought of as being due to other factors, also are closely related to things going wrong with the blood vessels. Now, dementia is a huge problem. There's almost 50 million people living with dementia worldwide. There are somewhere in the region of nearly 8 million new cases per year. It's a massively expensive condition in the European Union. It's amounting to about £160 billion per year. It's a major cause of dependency and disability. We don't have any particularly good treatments for it, and we're so far not very good at preventing it. Now, conditions such as Alzheimer's disease are considered to be the commonest cause, and vascular dementia, so-called, is thought to be the second commonest cause. But actually, there's a considerable amount of overlap between those two. And if you consider vascular dementia plus mixed dementias, then the blood vessel component, the obvious blood vessel component, is present in somewhere between 20 and 45% of all cases. And the important thing here is we know a lot about blood vessel diseases from stroke. So at least from that point of view, we should be able to do something about this, but there's a lot of overlap. And I think some of this is partly historical. For example, stroke and dementia have typically been thought of as rather different conditions. Stroke is thought of as a physical condition, and dementia is typically thought of as a memory problem, and they tend to get sort of siloed a bit, not just from a research point of view, but also from a clinical point of view, from going to the hospital and going to the doctor. But there's a lot of overlap between them. So these two seem to be linked together by a problem in the smaller blood vessels running into the brain. And typically that's been referred to as silent cerebrovascular disease, or more recently it's talked about as something called small vessel disease. Now, small vessel disease can affect you in several ways. For example, it might give you a little teeny-weeny stroke that you notice as a stroke, and it leads you to going to the doctor. And it's quite a mild type of stroke, so it's been rather ignored. People haven't paid as much attention to it, but actually it causes quite a lot of problems. It doesn't usually lead to your demise, but it may lead to further cognitive problems, and it may lead to you having more of these, which cause further problems. And then we have these more diffuse areas of abnormality in the brain, which tend to present more as if it's a cognitive problem, and that contributes to many of these worldwide dementias because of the overlap with other types of dementia. It also causes balance and walking problems. It can present with depression, particularly in older people. And so basically there's a considerable overlap between these two. Now, not only that, but relatively recently, it's also been recognized that in people who you would traditionally think of as having a more pure form of Alzheimer's disease actually have abnormal blood vessel function before they develop symptoms. And if you have abnormal blood vessel function and you have evidence of Alzheimer's disease, then you're likely to have worse symptoms than if you just had the Alzheimer's disease or the blood vessel disease on its own. So there's a kind of interaction here that indicates that the blood vessels are really important, and they may have been slightly ignored. And here's a very good example, because this is a scan taken from a study in which they looked at people with a familial, so this is where people have a bad family history of dementia. And I don't just mean getting dementia at older ages, I mean people who develop dementia in their 40s or 50s, so much younger than you would normally expect. And in those people, what they found was that they started to develop these white blobs in their white matter many years before they actually started to get symptoms. And this was quite striking compared with other family members who didn't have the particular gene that was leading to these people being at risk of developing dementia. And we also know that many of the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease are exactly the same as the risk factors for things like stroke. So high blood pressure, smoking, having a heart attack, having an abnormal heart rhythm, having too much fat in your blood, diabetes, being overweight. They are all risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, and they are all also well-established risk factors for stroke. And here is just a little list of all the currently known risk factors for both stroke and dementia. There is huge overlap. Some of them are clearly not changeable, like getting older, or if you happen to have a gene which we know is related to having a high likelihood of developing dementia or having a bad family history. But many of them are changeable. So, for example, heart disease, hypertension, high cholesterol, obesity, etc., are all to a certain extent either preventable or modifiable should you develop them. And there's some protective factors, such as being well educated, getting plenty of exercise, making sure you take your blood pressure pills or your fat, your cholesterol-lowering tablets, having an active lifestyle, eating a good diet with lots of green leafy vegetables, typically referred to as a Mediterranean diet. And if you do have an abnormal heart rhythm, then making sure that you take tablets that help prevent that and help stop little clots forming. So there's considerable overlap, however you look at this, between what is traditionally referred to as dementia of an Alzheimer's type and what is typically referred to as stroke, vascular disease. There's a large meeting in the middle of the two, and most of these actually are related to blood vessel problems. So what's going on here? Why do we have this sort of mix-up situation? So if we just think about this problem with the little blood vessels that run into the brain, as I've mentioned, it can either lead to you having something which makes you go to the doctor because you think you've had a stroke, so little deep lesion in the brain, or actually more recently we've also realized that this underlying small vessel disease can also be a common cause of hemorrhage into the brain, because the little blood vessels get very fragile and they can burst easily. And then there are these so-called silent forms where these abnormalities build up on scanning. You can get little holes or these white areas which are disrupting the white matter fibers in your brain, or little tiny little black spots on this one, which are, this is a scan which is very sensitive to little tiny bleeding bits, so these are called microbleeds, and all of these are things which build up on scans and are representative of a problem in the underlying tiny blood vessels. And it used to be thought that these were quite separate, even within this category, that these little lacunar infarcts were different to the hemorrhages, but actually we now realize that really they're all part of a spectrum, and it's slightly artificial to think of them as if they're different. They're all related to each other. If you've got one of one, you're more likely to have some of one of the others. And it's just too easy, I think, when people look at a scan and they see little white blobs or they see little tiny little bleeding spots, to think that these are just little mini strokes and stop thinking about what might the underlying problem actually be. So if we take a more holistic view of this, we start to realize that this actually needs to be a much more joined up process. Another thing which I think has led to some problems with how we think about this is because of these different symptoms. So you don't know what's going on in your brain until something happens that leads you to go to see some expert who specializes in something or other, and then perhaps says, okay, I'm doing some neurological tests and send you for a scan and so on. So in the case of this problem in the little tiny blood vessels, you might develop a little stroke, or you might develop some subtle problems with thinking or working out problems, go to a memory clinic perhaps, or it might affect you in such a way that you feel less, it's associated with mood problems, feel a bit depressed. Combination of factors, could be several of those. The reasons why people get different symptoms is not clear. But the consequence of this is that you can end up in different places. And one of the problems is that, for example, and I see this every day, you can be sent to the stroke clinic because your GP, for example, thinks that you've had a small stroke. But you get to the stroke clinic and somebody thinks, actually, I think the main problem here is that you've got a memory problem. So let's send you to the memory clinic, because these things in clinical terms tend to be dealt with in separate places, and memory clinics run differently to stroke clinics. So off you go to the memory clinic, and then somebody says, actually, I think the main problem here is that you're having a bit of trouble getting around and walking, and so we need to send you to the mobility clinic, at which point you're probably getting slightly fed up and wondering what on earth is going on, and rather annoyed with the NHS and its inability to deliver a joined up and common sense sort of service. And my one message out of some of this is that really people who are either studying or trying to treat stroke and dementia should work much more closely together. Now, so we've got a kind of situation where possibly for historical reasons and just how people think about things, the fact that the blood vessels in the brain are really important to the brain have been slightly overlooked by people who tend to look at the brain because they're interested in the nerve cells. So we need to think a little bit more about why does this happen in the brain? What do the blood vessels do? What might they be doing? And so for a long time people have been trying to think about what might be causing this problem. And you may hear, because people come to this from the side of stroke, and stroke is about blood flow, just saying, oh, there's not enough blood flow. The blood flow is too low. That's why these things have appeared. Or if it's a stroke, saying, oh, it's just a little clot that's broken off, or some fatty thickening in the vessel wall that's led to the blood vessel getting narrowed. But actually, a lot of the studies that we've done and other people have done indicate that it's not just that actually there's a lot more going on than that, and it's actually mostly something that's happening deep in the brain, and you get these changes in the little blood vessels that run deep into the brain, and when it first starts you get just a little bit of minor thickening. These are the little blood vessels here. The vessel walls get a bit thick, so it's harder for the nutrients to get across the walls and so on. And then when it gets worse, the blood vessels start to get really quite ragged and fragile and so on, and this leads to this process building up in the brain. But that doesn't really tell us what's actually causing it. Now, this might look like a slightly complicated diagram, but I just wanted to use it to try and explain this to you. So this is a little blow-up of this little bit of the brain here. So we've got this blood vessel running along the surface, and then it runs down into the brain, and as it runs down it branches out and branches out, so it can get to these little tiny branches eventually which supply the individual nerve cells. And if you look at each of these levels as it gets down and thinner and thinner and thinner into the brain, you find that it starts out as quite a muscular, it can expand and contract easily, and gradually that muscular layer is lost and it gets more closely related to brain cells coming in and engulfing until you get down to the smallest size, which is called a capillary, and I'll come on to that just a bit more in a minute. But basically, what seems to be happening is that at this level is where we're getting the problem with some of the blood vessels, and that leads to, when it's not too bad to start with, some of these abnormalities showing up, which I've illustrated on scanning. And then as it gets worse, gradually it sort of spreads out across the brain so that you get more severe, all of the brain is affected, and that leads to these changes that we see on scanning. But if we just zoom in a little bit more and think about what's happening down at the tissue level in that capillary right next to those nerve cells, and in the spirit of Christmas, and I hope my neuroscience colleagues will allow me to take some liberties here with my interpretation of what the various different brain cells actually do. So this is a little cartoon of one of these little tiny capillaries in cross-section and the important brain cells round about. So we have the blood side of what's happening here, and we have the brain side of what's happening. And you have several quite important different categories of cell inside your brain. So first of all, everybody thinks about the neurons, and the neuron is the most important cell because it does the thinking. And it's the one that gets all the attention, and it's looked after and supplied with food and everything, etc., etc. And then we have these other cells called oligodendrocytes, which rather magically encase the little wires that come out of the neurons with a sort of fatty substance that acts like the plastic coating on a copper cable. And that makes the nerve stimuli, the electrical signals, go much faster. Otherwise, we would all be really slow. But because it's got these little fatty areas along the nerve cell, it means the electrical signal can jump along and move much faster, so things can happen much faster. And those cells are really important, and they wrap every single nerve process. And then we have something called the astrocyte. It's another really important class of cell, and it's can sort of think of it a bit as a kind of go-between, because basically what it does is it helps to get the food to the nerve cells, and it kind of looks after the nerve cells and sort of pampers the nerve cells a bit, and it takes the signals from the nerve cells so that when the nerve cells need more food or more oxygen, the astrocytes can signal that more supplies are needed. And then we have some membranes that coat around the actual blood vessel cells. And then we have two really important blood vessel cells. One is called the pericyte, which instead of calling it Tiny Tim, I have called it Pip. And these are important cells because they help to, instead of being big muscle cells, they're like small muscle cells, and they help to control the blood flow and direct it down the right blood vessels. And they do this in conjunction with the other really important blood vessel cell, and this cell lines the blood vessel, and it's extremely important. And I thought Epiphany was a really good name for it, actually, because in terms of understanding neuroscience, these cells are exceptionally important, even if they are considered to be on the blood side of this construct. And this construct, this group of cells, is commonly referred to as the neurovascular unit, because basically it functions as a unit. You take any one of these cells on its own and it might last for a little while, but it wouldn't last for very long, because they all need each other. And it would be really nice if, our politicians could perhaps take a little message from this and work together instead of being completely at cross purposes with each other. Because in addition to the important jobs of making the signals go faster and signaling down to the blood vessel that it needs more oxygen, there are other interactions which we're just only beginning to realize about how these cells work with each other, support each other. For example, the cells lining the blood vessel, the endothelial epiphany cells, signal to the cells causing the wrapping the around the nerve cells here, the ones that make the signals go faster. And they help these cells grow, and they help them repair when there's a problem. And you know, when something goes wrong with these cells here, they can actually lead to damage to these cells. So there's a lot more going on than just this, but those are the kind of really important points. And so one other thing I just wanted to mention was that there's a number of other chemicals that are really important, and one of the most important ones is something that's a really simple chemical. It's called nitric oxide, or NO, and you can think of it as a kind of, it's partly a signaler, it partly helps to keep your blood vessel lining healthy. You could think of it as a kind of moisturizer, if you like, for your blood vessel lining. It keeps it nice and supple and healthy. And those elements are all really important. And now if you think about, so when the nerve cells start to do some work, so for example, they start to send some signals, they need more food, they need more oxygen, otherwise they're going to run out of energy really quickly. So they quickly send signals via the astrocytes, who quickly send even more signals to the endothelial cells and the pericytes, which their job is to say, okay, more blood, we need more blood down here, right now. And how they do that is by also sending electrical signals. So the cells in the brain that people think of as being electric, as the neurons, are not the only cells which work by electrical signaling. And this is something that's only recently been demonstrated, but what happens is that the endothelial cells send electrical signals back up to the main blood supply to open up those vessels, and whoosh, down comes more blood to where it's absolutely needed. So that's a kind of important construct about what's going on. A couple of other things you need to know. Back up, slightly higher level. The little endothelial cells are joined together by junctions, and these junctions help to keep what needs to be in the blood, allow out what needs to get out to help nourish the brain, and get back all the waste products. So that's an important regulatory area. The astrocytes do not only help supply food to the nerve cells, but they are also really important in regulating the flow of fluid and the washing out of waste products from the brain. And some of those waste products are washed into a little space around about each blood vessel, and then they can be whooshed back out and drained away in the fluid which bathes the brain. And those are very important processes which help to keep you healthy. So with that overview of how things happen normally, what happens when things start to go wrong? Well, a few things go wrong. We don't know the precise order in which these happen, but we know that they all happen to some extent. And one of the things that happens is that your blood vessels, these little tiny things, start to get a little bit leaky. So instead of controlling the entry and exit of materials into the brain as well as they should do, just things start to leak out. So you get a little bit more fluid, you might get some abnormal proteins, they might trigger other things. It happens very gradually. It happens most obviously in little areas of abnormality. This is a leak map. So wherever there is a bright spot, that means there is more leakage, and there's more leakage in these abnormal white damage areas and in these little holes. But actually, if you do some detailed measurements, you can see that there is leak right throughout the apparently normal tissues. It basically indicates that there's a little bit more water there than there should be. If you think about the thing about the water and the electricity, it's not a great idea to have that. And if it's there for a long time, it starts to damage the wiring and the other cells. Something else that happens is that the blood vessels, instead of opening up to supply more nutrients when necessary, they stop working quite so well. And this is something you can measure in a scanner. Here's a little diagram of somebody ready to go in the scanner, and what you do here is you have to do something to challenge the blood vessels to make them open up, and then you can measure how much they can open up. And one way of doing that is by breathing a little bit of air that has more carbon dioxide in it than it should do, and that makes your blood vessels open up, and so you can objectively measure how well your blood vessels are working. And so this is just a little example. And as the blood vessels open up, the blood flow increases, and you can actually measure these changes. And then you can produce a little map of what the overall distribution of the ability of the blood vessels to open up looks like. And if you put all that together and look at people who have a range of ages and degrees of abnormality of lesions in the brain, etc., then what you find is that the more of these white areas that you have, the less able your blood vessels are to open up when necessary, which means that they're not going to be able to supply as much blood and oxygen as they should be able to. And this gets worse if you have high blood pressure, if you have diabetes. I mean, all of these vascular risk factors again, and I'm afraid, like everything else, it also declines slightly as you get older, but not massively, so long as you don't have things like high blood pressure and so on. A lot of this is about the adverse vascular risk factors, and not just because people are getting older. Now, what else happens? Something else happens is that the blood vessels also get stiffer. So not only do they not open up as well, but they actually get kind of like, instead of being nice and elastic, they get a little bit more like lead pipes. And you can also measure this on a scan, and you can measure it at different points in the brain, and then you can produce little graphs like this, and you can use that to calculate how stiff the blood vessels are. And what you find again is that as this stiffness gets worse, you have worse damage in the brain. You also find, if you look really closely, that you can actually see the little spaces. These little teeny weeny white lines are little spaces around the tiny blood vessels as they run into the brain, and you shouldn't normally see those. If you do see them, it means that they're not functioning as well as they should. They're getting stagnated, and the more they stagnate, here's a little blow-up image of these little spaces, the more you get these little puffy areas starting to form around these spaces, indicating that this stagnation process is leading to secondary brain injury, which is all of the stuff that I've been showing you earlier. Now, you might wonder how that's happening, and this is just an example. Now, this is from a group of colleagues who work in the United States, and this is actually from a rat, where they've been able to look at the blood vessels, tiny blood vessels running into the brain in a rat. And what they did was they injected some particles, not into the blood vessels, but into the space around the blood vessels. And then they looked at how those moved along, because if you're going to wash out all this rubbish along those little spaces around the blood vessels, it needs to be a nice, smooth process. And if you're wondering why the stiffness matters, it's because if you look at the top, what you see is, so this is a rat, that's a normal blood pressure, nice elastic blood vessels. The particles, which are the little coloured streamers, are moving nice and smoothly along these spaces. So if you can imagine those were little particles of beta amyloid, which is a protein that builds up in cases of Alzheimer's disease, or other debris which should be washed out, it's moving along nice and smoothly. Whereas if you look at the bottom, which is a rat with high blood pressure, it's much more jittery. Not only that, the movement of these little particles is much more jittery, and there are some of them which are actually just piling up and not washing out properly. So the point here is, if you sort of think back to how this is working in the human brain, happening on a kind of long-term level, instead of flushing things through nicely with your 1.5 liters per minute of blood and pulsation to clear out your spaces, is just not getting out properly. And that's how the stagnation starts, and then these lesions can build up. So why is this relevant to Alzheimer's disease? Well, this vessel stiffness has been shown in human studies to increase the deposition of the beta amyloid protein, which is a marker of Alzheimer's disease. If you have high blood pressure, it worsens the deposition of these proteins, and basically you're not flushing these waste proteins and fluid out of the brain properly. What can we do about it? Okay. Now, I would have had a prop packet of mince pies, but unfortunately, it got eaten. So I don't. But you'll just have to imagine a mince pie. So, okay, it's got fruit in it, but you might wonder if it's Santa or the reindeer who's on the healthier option. If you just look at some of the stuff. So this is the typical nutritional content of a well-known brand of mince pie. One mince pie contains 12% of your daily energy requirement. And I think this is actually a really generous daily energy requirement because these values are set for very active young adults. And most of us who sit in front of a computer all day cannot possibly imagine that we are very active young adults. So you wouldn't need to eat very many of these, and that's your entire day's energy intake. And anything above that is going to get deposited as storage somewhere that you don't want it. It's got 22% of your sugar intake for a day. Now, sugar is one of the really, killer things in terms of vascular health. It's got a not insignificant amount of your salt, and I think we have far too high daily salt, so-called requirements. They're probably way in excess of what we actually need. So, the obvious things that we have, blood pressure, smoking, diabetes, all of these are risk factors. All of these are highly modifiable. Cholesterol, taking too much salt in the diet, having a diet that's high in red meat, diet that's high in processed meats, a diet in which you don't eat enough fruit and vegetables, are all adverse risk factors, and they are all very easy things to do something about, allowing for willpower. But it's nearly time for New Year, and it's a good time to make new resolutions. Not enough exercise. I would just like to flag that one up because exercise, I think, has been underrated as an important way of managing your vascular health. And this is about vascular health and maintaining brain health. So there are now quite a large number of studies, both observational studies and also increasing numbers of clinical trials, which show that people who take more exercise, just on a routine, it might just be walking a bit further every day instead of driving a car, going upstairs instead of taking a lift, all that stuff. People who exercise more have less damage to their white matter, have less brain shrinkage, and they have less cognitive decline when they're in their 70s. Exercise also helps recovery after stroke, and it also helps recovery after any acute medical illness in older people particularly, because that's what's been studied. But it may well also be true of younger people. And one of the reasons that exercise probably does this is because it helps keep healthy levels of these good chemicals, particularly this nitric oxide, which you can consider as a moisturizer for the blood vessels. Vegetables, particularly green leafy vegetables, kale is very popular at the moment, but spinach, beetroot. Beetroot is a fabulous source of nitric oxide. All of this helps keep your blood vessel lining nice and healthy and helps clear out all the rubbish from the blood vessels. So, I have some Christmas messages, which I hope you haven't ignored. So, aimed mainly at my neuroscience colleagues, do not forget the blood vessels. The blood vessels are very important. The brain does not work without blood vessels. You would not expect your Ferrari car to work without the petrol. So why would you expect your brain to work without the blood and the blood vessels? Every brain cell has a blood vessel. And if you take nothing away from this except remembering epiphany, the endothelial cell, and PEP, the pericyte, they are really important, and you must study them in your research to understand how they work in conjunction with the other cooperative brain cells. Otherwise, we're not going to make a lot of progress. It's really important. Now, my Christmas wishes are that people should work more closely together. People should be able to go to a stroke clinic, and if they have a cognitive problem rather than a stroke problem, it should get dealt with, rather than, oh, sorry, you're in the wrong clinic, go somewhere else. And researchers should be more holistic, and vice versa. I hope that the researchers will remember the blood vessels, and I would like to wish you all a peaceful Christmas and a happy 2019. Not too many mince pies.